Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Jim Zarin, President of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you who are listening on OPB or KBBS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining us for this week's Friday Forum. Are we on now? Better? Okay, let me start over. Good afternoon, I'm Jim Zarin. Welcome to the City Club of Portland, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you who are listening on OPB or KBPS radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining us for this week's Friday Forum on the 29th of May, 2009. Today we will welcome a former governor of Oregon who will address the topic, the unfinished business of the baby boom generation. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audience, I ask everyone in the room, if you have not already done so, to please turn off your cell phones or any other devices that make noise. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, without whose generous financial support these time-honored City Club Friday luncheons would not be possible. Our corporate sponsors for this quarter are the law firm of Schwabe, Williamson & Wyatt, Northwest Natural, and Portland General Electric. Today is the last Friday of this quarter, so please join me in offering an especially sincere thank you to all three of these sponsors for their support during these last 3 months. And if your company or firm would like to be a sponsor of our Friday Forums or of our nationally recognized citizen-driven research program, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the club office. City Club's membership drive ends at the end of this month, so if you have not already become a City Club member, or if you are a lapsed member who has not yet rejoined, now is the time. And if you are a member who has been thinking of recruiting a friend, colleague, or relative to become a member or to rejoin the club, now is the time. Until the end of the month, City Club is waiving its $25 new membership fee. Also until the end of the month, each member who recruits a new or lapsed member to join, as well as the new member, will each receive a voucher for a free Friday Forum of their choice. Membership forms are available with club staff at the membership table in the back of the room, or you can join online or by calling the club's office. Now we have 4 new members with us today, and I'd like to ask them to stand and stay standing as I introduce them, and then we'll give them all a welcome after they're all introduced. First, Susan Monty. Second, Andrew Hansen, a software engineer with Web Trends. Third, Paige Lambert from Pacific Northwest Sculptors. And Laurel Robbins of the Archimedes Movement. Welcome all. Thank you for being here. City Club's popular Citizen Salon Dinner and Discussion Series opens on June 11th with the topic, Twitter for Grown-Ups. Learn about social networking, discuss why Twitter has become so popular, and learn how you too can send what I understand is called a tweet. Citizen salons continue throughout the summer with topics ranging from local foods to urban planning. To learn about upcoming City Club citizen salons, including one with guest provocateur Mayor Sam Adams, please go to the City Club website. At next week's Friday Forum on June 5th, we will welcome a panel who will discuss how we can best promote great teaching in our schools and thereby improve student achievement in Oregon. That's here at City Club's Friday Forum next week. And now to today's program. The baby boom generation, of course, came of age in the 1960s, a time of great social change, involving fights for civil rights and racial and gender equality, a major federal government intervention against economic inequality called the War on Poverty, the anti-war movement on university campuses and in the streets against the real war in Vietnam, a social awakening of the importance of the natural environment and our planet, the landing of a man on the moon, and an idealistic questioning of traditional values and ways of life. Now, as the baby boom generation is reaching retirement age, it is interesting to consider where this society has ended up since that pivotal decade of the 1960s in American history. Where are we now in this country regarding the great societal challenges that we baby boomers teed up when we were young? What kind of job have we done in the last 40 or 50 years in improving life overall in this country, in enhancing our society, in caring for the planet? And what unfinished business and new challenges should we now be focusing on as we proceed with turning things over to the next generations? Today we are fortunate to have with us a former governor of Oregon who has thought a great deal about these questions and who will offer up his own answers and perspectives. And if news reports are true, and we don't know, he also may have something to say about his own plans to provide leadership on these issues here in Oregon. Our speaker, indeed, is a baby boomer born in 1947, a 1965 graduate of South Eugene High School, and a 1965 graduate of South Eugene High School, and a 1969 graduate of Dartmouth College. In 1973, he earned his medical degree from what is now Oregon Health and Sciences University, OHSU, here in Portland, and began practicing medicine in Roseburg as an emergency room physician. In 1979, he began his political career by getting elected to the Oregon House of Representatives as a Democrat, no small feat considering the traditionally conservative nature of his Southern Oregon district. At the end of his first term in the House, he was elected to the first of 3 terms in the Oregon Senate, where he served as president of the Senate from 1985 to 1993 and achieved significant acclaim as the author of the groundbreaking Oregon Health Plan. As we know, in 1995, he was elected governor of Oregon, and he was reelected to that position in 1999. Since leaving the office of governor in 2003, he has served in leadership positions at Estes Park Institute in Colorado, which conducts annual conferences for community hospitals, the Center for Evidence-Based Policy at OHSU, the Foundation for Medical Evidence here in Oregon, and the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in Massachusetts. In 2006, he launched the Archimedes Movement, an organized effort to channel growing concern about our society's health care system into not only a vision for a better system, but also the conditions necessary to achieve the vision. Please help me welcome back to this podium for what he thinks is probably the 15th time, today's speaker, and the only person for sure who can tell us whether he will or won't run again, former Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber. Governor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope the acoustics are better out there than they are up here. The late John Gardner once said that we are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised as unsolvable problems. And I think that's an apt description for the challenges we face today. A stalled economy, rising unemployment, frozen credit, massive debt, and a political system that clings tenaciously to the past. Yet embedded in these problems is the opportunity, I think, for truly transformational change, the kind of change that would not be possible under other circumstances. And of all the challenges we face today, there are 3 in particular that cry out for this kind of change. First is a system of public education that we have put at risk of failing the fastest growing segments of our population and leaving us far behind some of our international competitors in the training of a globally competitive workforce. Second is our dependence on fossil fuel and the necessity to transition to an economy based on clean, renewable sources of energy. And third is a healthcare system that is driving us relentlessly towards fiscal insolvency. Now, these 3 issues actually share a lot in common. First of all, our healthcare system, our energy system, and our public education system were built around programs and policies put in place in the middle of the last century. Second, although these programs and policies made sense at the time they were created, they have not evolved to meet the changing circumstances around them. And finally, restructuring them to effectively reflect the realities of the 21st century is very, very difficult because in the political process they are protected by significant economic interests that are deeply invested in the status quo. So it seems to me that the central challenge we face today is how to make the transition to a more sustainable future when so many of our jobs So much of our economy, and indeed so much of our way of life, are deeply dependent on these outdated programs and policies. To understand the nature of this challenge and its importance to our future, it's necessary, I think, to take a moment and view it through the lens of the generations that preceded us and the lens of the generations which will follow us. So to do that, let me start with a question. How many of you here are between 45 and 63 years old? Take a look around. Okay, we are the baby boom generation. There are 78 million of us, 30% of the US population. We were born between 1946 and 1964, most of us children of people who weathered the Great Depression, who fought in the Second World War, and helped rebuild the world in its aftermath. My parents, I think, were typical of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. My father served in the European theater, entering Europe through Normandy, and marched all the way across Europe through the Battle of the Bulge to Berlin. And from the day he was drafted and during the 17 months he was with Patton's army in Europe, my parents wrote to each other almost every day. And I've always thought it was a poignant tribute to their 65-year romance that they kept all those letters. And in 2002, my father edited them into something he called the War Letters, and he gave a copy to me and a copy to each of my two sisters. This is a very remarkable document, and it covers the period between August of 1943 and November of 1944, and it tells the story of two ordinary citizens and new parents and the incredible sacrifices that they made to win the Second World War. And before my dad died in 2007, I used to call him up every single June 6th, which is the anniversary of D-Day, and I would thank him for saving the world. Because that is literally what that generation did. But not only did they win the Second World War, they created our system of higher education and our transportation system and the transmission grid. They went to the moon. They eradicated polio and smallpox, and they created these great social programs of the 20th century, the GI Bill and Social Security, and of course Medicare and Medicaid. Now these remarkable accomplishments, these programs and policies and institutions were the vehicles through which our parents and grandparents sought to make the world a better place for us. And in so many ways they did, because as a direct result of these investments and sacrifices, our generation has enjoyed more promise and more opportunity than probably any other generation in the history of our country. But ironically, and unintentionally, at the same time, these same programs and policies laid the foundation for many of the major challenges we face today. Suburbia, the viability of which depends on the automobile and low-cost fuel. An economy deeply dependent on fossil fuel in general and imported oil in particular. A medical system, unsustainable medical system that is moving us ever closer to fiscal insolvency. In short, a way of life that is increasingly dependent on the relentless and unsustainable consumption of resources, both fiscal and natural, that rightly belong to future generations. Consider the fact that in 2011, 18 months from now, the leading edge of the baby boom generation will become eligible for Medicare, creating an estimated deficit of over $70 trillion. Now, for a country that's become acclimated to big numbers, $700 billion for Wall Street, $730 billion for the stimulus package, billions for the auto industry, it's easy to lose sight of what $1 trillion really is. So I have an exercise for you. When you go home, get out your calculator and do this little exercise. I call it Zeros Matter. 1 million seconds ago was last week. 1 billion seconds ago, Nixon was leaving the White House. 1 trillion seconds ago was 30,000 BC. Now, the projected unfunded entitlement in Medicare is $70 trillion, and we're planning to finance that by selling securities to Japan and China and other countries that are still willing to purchase them, giving huge leverage to some of our major international competitors, threatening the fiscal stability of our government, and leaving our children with a huge, staggering burden of debt. Furthermore, the opportunity costs involved in a debt of that magnitude will make it very difficult to invest in education and job creation and the R&D and other transitional investments needed to move to a low-carbon economy. Consider the fact that each year Oregonians spend $10 billion on energy, and 85% of that, $8.5 billion, leaves our state. That's money that doesn't go to shore up our economy or create jobs in Oregon or help us solve our fiscal problems. To put that into perspective, $8.5 billion is twice as much money as Oregon spends each year on K through 12 community colleges and higher ed combined. Albert Einstein once said that you should not use an old map to explore a new world. And that's exactly the point we find ourselves at today. Because every new generation faces a new set of challenges. Challenges that cannot be solved by clinging to the past, but only by imagining a new world and a new set of tools through which to get there. We are continuing to use an old map even as we move into the uncharted waters of the future. And whether the issue is healthcare, or public education, or energy, or transportation, the political dynamic is essentially the same. A strong and to some extent understandable tendency to shore up failing institutions and policies rather than trying to transcend them. The $734 billion in the stimulus package, the American Recovery and Revitalization Act, is a case in point. First of all, this money went directly into the deficit. In other words, we borrowed it. These are resources that we essentially borrowed from our kids. So it seems to me there is a moral imperative to use that money in a way that actually creates a return on investment, that reduces future debt rather than increasing it, that increases rather than reduces the opportunities that are going to be available to our children, that begins to create a new economic paradigm rather than simply reinforcing the current one. But in many cases, that is simply not happening. For example, the stimulus package contains $108 billion for health care, going to help states pay for the existing Medicaid program, and to provide a 60% public subsidy to help the uninsured access health insurance under COBRA. Now, I don't mean to minimize the importance of having affordable health insurance. My point is, this is $108 billion that's being spent to prop up a deeply flawed and profoundly inefficient healthcare system that consumes nearly 17% of the gross domestic product and contributes only marginally to the health of the population. The same thing can be said for the money we borrowed for education and for transportation. Of the $100 billion dedicated to K through 12, 95% will do little more than retain existing teachers while ignoring the conditions that actually constrain them. Only 5% will be spent to reform the system to improve student achievements and to transform public education in America. And almost all of the transportation money is not going to go to reducing our dependence on fossil fuel, but rather to shore up and invest and expand our existing surface transportation system. Now, don't misunderstand me. We all need timely access to affordable, effective medical care. We need to support our teachers. We need to keep class sizes down, and we do need to invest in our aging physical transportation infrastructure. But if that is all we do, if we simply continue to borrow from the future to finance today's programs, if we fail to create a new map for new times, if we are unable politically to rethink these programs and the policies which underlie them in the light of a new world, in the light of a new set of economic and demographic realities, then we will have lost the opportunity to shape our own future and will be relegated to simply reacting to the changing circumstances around us, and I know that we are better than that. William Jennings Bryan once said that destiny is not a matter of chance, it's a matter of choice. It's not a thing to be waited for. It's a thing to be achieved. The real legacy of the greatest generation was a half-century of opportunity that allowed each subsequent generation to improve themselves over the previous one, to be better educated, better paid, better prepared. The legacy is being lost because our politics won't allow us to address problems that were not foreseen by our parents and by our grandparents. So what are we going to have to do to move beyond short-term crisis management to the long-term investments that are needed to move to a more sustainable future? And I think there are at least three things involved. First of all, we need a clear idea of our strategic objectives, of what we want from our system of public education, or our healthcare system, our transportation system, or our energy system. What we want our economy and our society to look like 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, and the role that we see education and transportation and healthcare playing in achieving that future. Second, we need an accurate diagnosis of the underlying problem we're trying to address. Why our current programs and policies are shackling us to the past and preventing us from realizing our full potential as individuals and as a society, and we need to recognize the profound risks of continuing to cling to the status quo. And finally, we need to recognize that the political challenge lies in managing the transition, in shifting the debate from where we want to end up to how we're actually going to go there, and thereby providing the context for the individual steps and the investments and short-term sacrifices that we're going to need in order to get there. So let me take a moment and use healthcare and public education to illustrate these 3 points. In healthcare, we need to start with a very basic question. What is our objective? What do we want the healthcare system to accomplish? And it seems to me that the objective of the healthcare system is not merely to finance and deliver medical care. The objective of the healthcare system is to produce healthy people. In other words, medical care is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. It has no intrinsic value outside its relationship to a health outcome except as an economic commodity. And that point has got to be reflected in our system objectives. Now, I think Dr. Don Berwick and his team at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement have captured this in 3 elegant system objectives, which he calls the triple aim. First, to improve the health of a defined population. Second, to reduce per capita cost. And third, to improve the patient experience in terms of clinical outcomes and patient safety and patient satisfaction. Unfortunately, most of the healthcare debate today at both the state and national level is not focused on how to create a system that will improve the health of Americans, but rather how to pay for the system that we already have. And I submit that as a fundamental misdiagnosis of the problem. The problem isn't how we pay for healthcare, the problem is what we're buying and how that care is organized and delivered. The problem is in the system itself. And to illustrate that, let me use an analogy by comparing the performance of our healthcare system to the performance of an automobile. Just bear with me a minute. You'll get it. We all know that every car has a maximum speed, right? So you can take your Porsche or your GMC pickup or your old Honda Civic out to the Bonneville Salt Flats, put the pedal to the floor, and pretty soon that car is going to be going as fast as it's going to go. It's going to reach its maximum speed. Now, what if you don't like it? What if you want it to go faster? What are your options? Well, you can yell at your car, I suppose. You can offer it an incentive of some sort. You can file an incident report with somebody. You can lobby Salem and pass a car owner's Bill of Rights. But the fact is, the car's not going to go any faster because the maximum speed is a function of the car itself. It's built into the car. And by the same token, the inefficiencies and poor performance of the U.S. healthcare system is a function of the system. It's built into the system, and that won't change by simply changing who pays for it or by throwing more money at it. And this becomes obvious when we look at the determinants of health, those things that have the greatest impact on people's lifetime health status. 40% are lifestyle and behavioral issues. 15% are socioeconomic factors. 30% are genetics. Only 10% has anything to do with involvement with the U.S. medical system. In other words, 90% of what affects your lifetime health status has nothing to do with health care. Now, this huge discrepancy between what we're spending on health care and what we're getting in terms of health has nothing to do with money. We're already spending $2.5 trillion a year on medical care. It has to do with the system itself. It has to do with the way health care delivery is financed and organized. Consider the fact that because we have no explicit policy of universal coverage, millions of people delay or avoid needed medical care or have to go to the emergency room when they're very, very sick. And because federal law requires that we see everybody in the emergency room, the ER has become our de facto policy of universal access. And it's a policy that says, in effect, we won't pay pennies to manage your blood pressure in the community, but we'll pay tens of thousands of dollars to treat your stroke in the hospital. It's a policy that says we won't make sure all our women have adequate prenatal care, but we're happy to pick up the cost of resuscitating a 500-gram infant in the neonatal intensive care unit. And that shouldn't be acceptable to us. Consider the fact that 80%, probably over 80%, of the money in the system goes to treat the acute medical complications of people with one or more chronic conditions, like diabetes or congestive heart failure or asthma, and almost nothing goes to preventing those conditions in the first place or avoiding the acute medical complications through the appropriate day-to-day management of the conditions. Indeed, in the United States healthcare system, there are 9,000 different billing codes through which hospitals and doctors get paid, but there's no code for a cure. Hello? There's no code for prevention. There's no code for health improvement. They're not billable events. So at the end of the day, the vast majority of money in a healthcare system goes to finance avoidable acute care problems at the expense of prevention and wellness and the appropriate management of chronic conditions. Now let's run this same process through our system of public education. What's the desired purpose of our schools? What is our objective? Well, it seems to me that the objective is not, in fact, to reduce class sizes or lengthen the school year or expand electives, as important as those things are. The objective of the public education system, to me, is to help equip every Oregon child to achieve their full potential as individuals, as members of the workforce, and members of society. Class sizes and school years and electives are means to that end, but they're not end in themselves. Yet today, most of the focus, the political debate, is not on how to create a system that can actually provide each individual with the opportunity to achieve their full potential, but how to fund the system that we already have. Now, our teachers are very, very remarkable people. They dedicate their lives to actually helping people achieve their full potential, and they derive deep personal gratification in the success of those they serve. But they are constrained by a system that makes their jobs a lot harder than they already are. We need to make sure that opportunity is the product of the public education system, not the casualty of an overburdened system in need of a new design. And lost in this debate over how to pay for our existing education system and our existing healthcare system are a set of investments that could significantly reduce the cost of both healthcare and public education. And those are the investments that 55% of factors that are related to lifetime health status that have to do with lifestyle and behavior and socioeconomic issues. If indeed 40% of what determines your lifetime health status is based on behavior and lifestyle, it's easy to conclude, which many people do, is that if individuals just made better choices, if they assume more personal responsibility, we could significantly reduce the disease burden coming into the medical system. And while that is true up to a point, for many people, the ability, the capacity to exercise those choices is profoundly impacted by a complicated set of socioeconomic factors. So for many people, these choices aren't choices at all. We know, for example, that socioeconomic status has a huge impact on health. People at the bottom of the income scale are twice as likely to die prematurely or suffer a serious medical illness than people at the top of the income scale. We also know that there is an easily identifiable set of social and medical risk factors to which kids are subjected in their very early years that occur in the home and in the community. Things like teen pregnancy, poverty, chronic unemployment, domestic violence, substance abuse, involvement in the criminal justice system. And if unaddressed, there is an almost linear correlation between those risk factors, school failure, school dropout, social dependency, and involvement in the criminal justice system. And by the same token, we know that the lifestyle patterns and behaviors that lead to childhood obesity and type 2 diabetes and congestive heart failure are also locked in very, very early in life and are profoundly impacted by people's socioeconomic status. But because the kinds of interventions and supports that are necessary, the kinds of childhood investments that are necessary to address these risk factors are not considered part of the healthcare system, they are always underfunded, always uncoordinated, and the very first things we cut during an economic downturn. So as a consequence, far too many children are growing up without good health habits, without the kind of family and community supports necessary to become successful and independent learners. And schools, in turn, are then being asked to do what families and communities and churches have been unable to do. And when these kids inevitably fail and drop out of school, we blame our school system and our teachers. The same thing happens with our healthcare system. Much of the burden in our healthcare system comes from exactly these same factors, which are not medical issues, but social and community issues. Much of the burden in our system results from people setting themselves up for disease and disability through their own choices, or being set up for disease and disability through circumstances beyond their control, and then we want our medical system to deal with the acute complications on the back end. So my point is that these expectations on both our healthcare system and our system on public education are not only unrealistic, they are very expensive, and they are clearly unattainable. So a sustained strategy of early childhood investment has got to be a foundational component of any system that we expect to improve the health of the population and do it at a lower cost. And the longer we wait to address these risk factors and these unhealthy behaviors, the harder it is to deflect kids back to a healthy life trajectory. It is much cheaper, for example, and much more effective to intervene and provide the family supports for an at-risk 3-year-old than it is to take an 18-year-old high school dropout hooked on methamphetamine and make the investments necessary to deflect them back to a healthy life trajectory. And by the same token, it is much easier and much cheaper to prevent childhood diabetes and obesity in the first place than it is to deal with the medical complications when they're in their 50s or their 60s. Now, it's worth noting that the kind of early childhood investments that are needed to reduce the burden on the healthcare system are exactly the same kind of investments, in some cases the same investments that we need to reduce the burden on our school system, to reduce social dependency, and to decrease the number of people who end up in prison rather than in the workforce. In other words, we cannot afford not to make these investments, and yet the fact is that we're failing to do so. My point is, I guess, in summary, that the current structure of the U.S. healthcare system is incapable of reducing the cost and improving the health of our population, any more than the current structure of our public education system is capable of equipping every child in Oregon to achieve their full potential. What we are doing has become part of the problem rather than part of the solution. Now, the problem here is that objectively reevaluating the structures of these programs creates a huge political challenge because of the sheer number of economic stakeholders who are deeply invested in the status quo. Today, for example, there are millions of people whose jobs depend on the dysfunctional structure of the U.S. healthcare system. 1 out of every 11 jobs in our economy is in the health sector. In short, we have a lot of trapped equity in the current structure of our current healthcare system and our system of public education, making the transition to a more rational and effective and sustainable future then puts at economic risk a whole lot of individuals and institutional stakeholders. And as a consequence, they have individually and collectively prevented us as a society from having an honest discussion of a set of problems that increasingly pose a clear and present danger to the future of our state and the future of our country. And let me give you an analogy for sort of where we are today. Imagine we've got a couple of rafts floating on a river. And we'll call one raft the healthcare system. And in that raft, we've got hospitals, doctors, consumers, employers, drug companies, insurance execs, et cetera, and they all got a stakeholder paddle. Okay? Then we have another raft. We'll call that the education system. And that raft, that's got teachers and school board members, principals, parents, students, and college and community college presidents. And they have their stakeholder paddles. And all of a sudden, they come around a bend in the river, and it disappears. And they can hear this ominous rumbling and see this mist rising from the rapidly approaching precipice. So what do they all do now that the danger is clearly in sight? Well, the first thing they do is they turn their backs to the danger. They grab their stakeholder paddles even tighter until their knuckles are white, and they start working mightily to keep their end of the raft upstream, deriving some perverse sense of security in the knowledge that the people on the other end will go over before they do. We can do better. We can do better. So the challenge here to successfully put together the politics necessary to create a more sustainable future require that we shift the focus of the debate from where we want to end up to how we get there. The challenge is to make the politics and economics of the transition explicit. Legitimize the economics and legitimize the politics. Don't pretend they don't exist, and shift the focus of the political debate from how an individual stakeholder is disadvantaged in the short term to how we can mitigate the impact on all the stakeholders during the process of transition to a more rational paradigm. But without first agreeing on where we want to end up, there is no political pathway by which to get there. As the Roman Senator Seneca once said, no wind is the right wind if you don't know what port you're sailing for. We know what we want. We want a system of public education that gives every child the opportunity to achieve their full potential, whatever that may be. We want a balance with the earth that does not compromise the air and water and natural resources available to future generations. And we want a healthcare system that will be at least as good in the future at producing health as the current system is at producing cost and red tape. The challenge here at the end of the day is a governance challenge. The challenge of how we, as a society, intentionally begin to reconcile the growing contradiction between the world we say we want to leave our children and the one we're actually creating through the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis. To rediscover our capacity to act in the common good, not just the individual good, and to ensure that our policies begin to reflect not just our individual interests today, but also the responsibilities that we owe to each other, and particularly that we owe to the future. Almost 50 years ago, President John Kennedy gave a bold challenge to America when he said in, I think it was September of 1962, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." What a lot of people don't know is just before he gave that speech, he was given a report from the National Science Council that said it wasn't possible to go to the moon. We didn't have the capacity. We didn't have the technology. We didn't have the tools. He gave the speech anyway. What John Kennedy gave us was not a roadmap, but a destination, a powerful vision and a common purpose that allowed us to motivate and engage the creativity and the innovation and the energy of the American people in order to get there. A century and a half ago, Oregon offered that same kind of destination to thousands of people who were willing to endure the immediate hardship and sacrifices and deprivations of the Oregon Trail in hope of a better future. Sacrifice and investment without a larger context simply won't happen. Yet sacrifice and investment for the common good has been part of the history of our nation, and it has been part of the history of our state. Perhaps we simply need to be reminded of who we are and what we're capable of. We need to blaze a new Oregon Trail by agreeing on our strategic objectives, on what we want our economy and our society here in Oregon to look like 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, and how we want education and transportation and healthcare and energy to help us achieve that objective. Then and only then will it be possible to shift the focus of our debate and the focus of our politics to the individual steps, to the investments, and yes, to the short-term sacrifices that are going to be necessary to realize that future. This is the unfinished business of the baby boom generation. And the challenges that we will have to overcome in this endeavor to make this crucial transition are not as obvious as the menace of the Third Reich that faced our parents' generation, but they are just as deadly sure, and partly because they are less obvious. They're less obvious than a Pearl Harbor. They're less tangible than the specter of a Nazi panzer division, snuffing out the flame of freedom as it rolls across the face of Europe. But I promise you this, those challenges, if we are successful in overcoming them, will have every bit as much an impact on the lives of our children and grandchildren as did the winning of the Second World War on our generation. Thank you.
The first question of our speaker is always from our Board of Governor host. Our board host today is Marge Kafori. Marge Kafori directed Portland's Office of Government Relations for many years. She's currently a political consultant and civic volunteer. Marge first joined City Club in 1980 when she was 10. She has been very active in the club. She has been a member of the Friday Forum Committee for many years. This year she chaired a special task force that studied the club's advocacy and awareness program. She's on her second stint as a member of the Board of Governors, became aboard this time in 2006. Marge?
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Governor. I am not going to ask about the elephant in the room today. I'm sure somebody will. My question is this: if a tax system is to provide economic stability, Oregon has one of the most unstable tax systems around. Yet recent attention to tax reform has been the functional equivalent of all hat and no cattle. Without a better tax system, is Oregon any more governable now than it was 6 years ago?
Well, there's no question that we need a much more stable tax structure. Two issues here. One is stability and one is adequacy. So we do have to have a more stable tax structure. It's very difficult to plan and make investments if you don't know how much money you're going to have. Whether it's a lot or a little, you need that stability. And there's a number of ways we could approach dealing with stability. But I think that begs the larger question. What we have to stop doing is arguing with Oregonians about money and start having a discussion with Oregonians about what we actually want, and then walk back from there in terms of what are the steps we need to take to get there and how are we going to pay for it. You know, most of the discussions about revenue take place during economic downturns. And the objective of that discussion is usually to fix the current system and stop the roof from leaking rather than a long-term policy development. So there's no context for what kind of return of investment the voters are going to get for taxes raised during a recession. So it seems to me there's a number of ways we can address the question of stability, but I think the larger question is to create a more concrete context for why we need revenue and how that relates to a common future for the state.
We'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership, so please identify yourself as a City Club member. Keep your question 30 seconds or less, and please ask a question, not make a speech. We'll end at 1:15. Thank you.
Mike Rosen, City Club and Stand for Children member. Governor Kitzhaber, both our sons need supportive home and school environments to survive. How would you like Oregon's public schools to be different 10 years from now? And it's okay if your response doesn't address funding.
Well, I think there are two issues. One of them is very controversial, and one of them is just not being done. 10 years from now, I would like to see a generation of children who are not disadvantaged coming through the doors of our kindergarten. As many as 60% of our kids, because of economic and sort of family deprivation, cannot fully participate in the learning experience. And those are the kids that struggle and drop out and add a huge remedial burden to the system of public education. So if we want to put children first, you've got to recognize that education doesn't start in kindergarten and that there are the years before that where we have to make those sustained investments that have huge benefits downstream, not just in education, but also in reduction in terms of costs of dependency and in the criminal justice system. The other thing we're going to have to come to terms with in our school system is really a result of ballot measure 5, which was the disconnect between the policy-making function and the funding function. It used to all take place at the local level, where the school boards would develop the policy and it would be funded through local property taxes. Now the funding responsibility is at the state level and the policy-making function is at the local level. And that is a system that defies responsible management and truly system-wide long-term planning, and I think that's one of the issues that we have to get on the table and figure out how to address.
Chris Allman, City Club member. Governor Kitzhaber, thank you very much for your pragmatic, honest vision. One of the things I struggle with as an education activist and a physician, an endocrinologist off the ramp of medicine, is income inequity. We've become a have-more society, and I'm wondering how you factor in what we need to do to get back on track to ensure that there's no sense of entitlement as we have a shared investment in everything that you would like to see move forward.
Well, let me take a cut at your question. I'm not sure where the entitlement part comes in. It seems like there's two questions in there maybe. The fact is that, and I will steal a term from Dr. Larry Wallach, but if you believe that the heart of the American dream really is the promise of opportunity, and that there is, in fact, a ladder of opportunity up which people can climb and be upwardly mobile and ensure that their kids have a better shake at things than their parents, then surely health is the first rung on that ladder, and education is right above it. And in order, as I mentioned in my speech, in order to have health and have an educated population, we have got to stop throwing babies in the river. We have got to invest on the front end, pennies to what we're spending on the back end. And we have to do that long term. Day in, day out, decade after decade. We can identify the at-risk children and families. We know what the supports and interventions are. They are proven and effective. And if we don't make that those kinds of investments, we are never going to achieve the kind of income equity, I think, that we would like to see in this country. On the other side of it, and everybody who raised their hands, we have got to talk about entitlements. The fact of the matter is, when Medicare was created, the healthcare system was very small, and we had a pretty small population. I find it astounding that people in this country have suddenly woken up and realized that, whoa, people born in 1946 are actually going to turn 65 in 2011. What news, you know? And if you pencil this out, it's not sustainable. This isn't about tearing down Medicare. It's not depriving health care to senior citizens. We have a shrinking workforce. The generation behind ours is 17% of the population, not 30%. And without making these kinds of investments to make them productive, it's going to be impossible for them to take care of us. So we need to step back and say, this isn't about entitlement. It's about intergenerational equity, and it's about moving forward together as a people, not as stakeholders or segments of a larger population.
Governor Kitzhaber, Barbara Wolf, City Club member, you have a wonderful vision. I guess my question is, you're saying to intervene early. What is your idea how you can make this happen? That's probably... Well,
we had actually in 2001, just before the state became ungovernable, we passed something called the Oregon Children's Plan. With good bipartisan support, we got, I think, $30 million in it. And essentially, it was a sort of a big demonstration project, voluntary program, but it offered to screen each firstborn child in Oregon for this set of social and medical risk factors, and if the family was interested, we could provide the supports. Now, a lot of that is substance abuse support. And of course, that was the first thing that got cut during the recession. But let me give you a statistic. I mean, so it's not that we don't know how to do it. It's a matter of putting together the politics, cutting through the amazing turf between agencies and all the different provider groups that do the same thing, and really creating a system. 1 out of every 2 children that is in foster care in Oregon, 50% of them, have at least one parent with an untreated substance abuse problem. It costs $16,000 a year to keep these children in foster care. It costs $2,000 to $3,000 a year to treat their parents. And if it's 2 kids, that's $32,000 a year. Almost half of the DHS budget is in Medicaid and family, adult, and children's services. And so it's right in front of us. And it seems to me that the reason that we have to sort of really clarify, I think lots of people have a vision for Oregon, but we have to clarify the 2 or 3 things that are going to actually have to happen. And we're going to have to figure out how to make those investments on the front end if we want to have the latitude to make some of those investments on the back end. We just have to do it. I know this guy.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Governor, the concentration of people and automobiles in cities is unsustainable. We need desperately alternatives. We need more space for our people. And public transportation could do it. And between the cities, railroads could do it instead of airplanes and automobiles. But the question is the money. My question is, will we have the wisdom and the will to change the funding dramatically? Or will we wait until we have to?
Well, I think I've been here 15 times, and you've asked me that question at least 15 times. And so I think that means there's a problem, right? I mean...
Sorry.
No. Your point's well taken. I think historically what we do is we wait until the crisis is upon us and then we try to fix it. I think that that will likely be too late. And I think there's really 2 parts to the solution. One is you do have to begin to shift resources to alternative transportation modalities. We don't have, I mean, oil goes, the price of gas goes up and down, but it is going to go up long term. There's less of it. The cost of getting it is worse. A lot of people who have it don't like us, and the Chinese are now the 2nd largest importer of foreign oil, competing directly with us for this shared resource. So we have to have that conversation, not in isolation around a transportation package, but in context of sort of where we want to end up 10 or 20 years from now. The second thing I think we need to recognize is that suburbia is a huge part of the problem. Suburbia was created sort of to reward the GIs coming home, and it is wonderful. And I live there, and I'm really a big part of the problem. There's a little film called The End of Suburbia. It's a sort of a Leave It to Beaver looking sort of film about that era. And I saw it right after I bought my house and I said, well, I came back to that house and said, boy, aren't you part of the problem? The fact is, suburbia depends on low-cost fuel and on the automobile. There's no places to walk for food or recreate, et cetera. So I think one of the land use challenges and really architectural and community challenges is to make suburbia a part of the solution by relocalizing and revitalizing suburbia, creating community-scale energy, completing community-scale agriculture, creating work centers so people don't actually have to come into town. I would venture that most of the people who drive in on the Sunset every morning are not going to manufacturing jobs. They're doing jobs that could actually be done somewhere else. So we need to think about that and start talking about that. And I think the other thing that we need to recognize, and this is a much longer answer than you asked, but since you've asked it 15 times, I want to give it a little. The other thing I think we need to think about in this country is that as the price of oil continues to increase, it's going to be less attractive as a business model to outsource jobs to China and then ship the goods back to the United States because of the embedded energy costs. And I believe that it's very likely that we're going to see sort of a relocalization of a lot of manufacturing and thinking through where that's going to be located and how we're going to get to and from it as a part of your land use planning transportation strategy, it seems to me would be a very, very sound idea.
I'm Don Wagoner, and do appreciate your points of view very much. I have a concern, and as a person who has spent a lot of time in strategic planning, it's really tough to get people to think. There are problems. There are real problems. Everybody has vested interests, and they are very effective in protecting them. How do you break through this? How do you get the dialogue going so that people even, beyond maybe this group, ask the questions and then be involved in developing the answers?
Well, I think, and this will be a somewhat oversimplification because of the breadth of your question, the time involved, but again, I think it has to do with making the politics and economics of transition explicit. If you have thousands of people whose jobs depend on the current U.S. healthcare system, and let's say they're technicians that are running redundant MRIs that don't really actually have to be done, or there are people that are shuffling insurance forms, neither of which necessarily add health to the system, that's still how they bring home food. That job is what puts bread on the table, and they're not going to just let go of it. So what you have to say is you have to say, what do we want the healthcare system to look like 10 years from now? Because this isn't going to happen overnight. It's going to take us a decade to get there. How do you take the people who are shuffling insurance forms or running redundant MRIs and put them out in the community checking on elderly people with congestive heart failure so that you can actually manage their disease at home rather than put them in the hospital? What is the workforce need of the future in healthcare, in growth industries like the green economy and jobs? And then how do we make that transition? And where I think we need to spend money is in the transition. And the analogy I'll give you is the auto industry. I don't think anyone wants to see the auto industry go belly up, but we also don't want them to produce a product that contributes to greenhouse gases and that no one will buy. So what we're giving the money for, presumably, is to retool that industry so it's going to produce a car that will be competitive with a Prius and can sell in Beijing and will reduce greenhouse gases. We're going to have to do the same thing, the same kind of investment to make the transition to a new healthcare system, and I think probably to a new educational system. But you can't get people to make those investments unless they can sort of see the context for where you're going. So every budget really needs to be not just a two-year balancing exercise, but a strategic step that's linked to future budgets. And we've done that in Oregon, not with a budget, but we did it with our land use planning program. It was a remarkable document that had a clear set of objectives, we call them the planning goals, and although it needed to be fine-tuned lately, it's stuck through administration, through changes in control of the legislature. And I think that's the same thing we have to do with these other just embedded problems that we have to face as a society.
Thank you, John. Milt Markowitz, City Club. And I'd like to ask you about two facets of what you talked about, maybe get some additional comment. One of them is that deeply embedded in what you said was a very powerful ethic. Who we are for the earth, who we are for each other, who we are for future generations. And I'm wondering if you just comment on the necessity for us having an ethical compass and how much that might have changed us getting into where we are today. And the second one is a little more tangential. You had talked about restructuring, but didn't say much more about it. And I wondered if you might comment a little bit on your own work and where we might go in terms of understanding current structure as the mechanical orientation that it has, and how we might restructure if we were to look at these systems organically so that there were components were fixed and the organization, and the structure was allowed to change.
What was the first part of the question?
The first part was about ethics, that
gotcha.
an ethical compass being as important as objectives.
Let me take a crack at that one. You know, this is really important, but I think we've lost sight of it. I mean, you very rarely hear these words spoken anymore, but there are two concepts on which I think the whole foundation of our society rests, and one is the concept of the common good, and one is the concept of stewardship. Now, any society is made up of people who don't always agree with one another. And so there has to be some mechanism to decide sort of what that common good is, and that's really been the role of government. I'd say it's not working very well right now, but that in fact is the vehicle through which we arrive at the common good. So we have to have an ethic that recognizes that to be part of a civilized nation or a society, there are certain obligations we owe to one another, not just to ourselves. I think we've lost that. We also have responsibility to make sure that we don't live our lives in a way that reduces opportunities, whether they're financial or environmental opportunities for our kids, and that's the concept of stewardship. And those are both I think, very, very important. I think what's happened to us really over the last 20 or 25 years is we've really become a me society. And there is a sense, I think, of entitlement. And our politics, as a result, have become very transactional. Vote for me and I'll lower your taxes. Vote for me and I'll fund schools first. Or I'll vote for you if you give me a prescription drug benefit in the Medicare program. And if you think about it, those transactional politics are all about me. They're not about us. They're about what I can get, not what I can give. And they don't foster any sense of the common good or common purpose. And so I think we need leadership, not just political leadership. We need civic leadership, business leadership, labor leadership to begin to talk about the importance of recreating that sense of community. I would just say finally that one of the things that I really realized when I was governor is that creating that sense of community is very powerful. When we created the Oregon Plan for Salmon and Watersheds, we were trying to get local private landowners to do more than simply avoid taking a species, but to do active restoration. And although those local watershed councils were designed to improve salmon habitat, they became very powerful tools for community building. People suddenly were doing things together on behalf of a shared place. I think the solution to our healthcare system is ultimately going to be around locally or regionally health communities, defined populations where you have that sense. And so I think the first challenge is to put that issue on the table and then begin to use that as a metric to judge how we organize our state services and our community services. And I think I'll pass on the second one, not because I'm not interested in it, but I could wax really wonky on that, and probably I've done enough damage already.
Sandra Walden, City Club member and owner of Commercial Solar Ventures, a solar company building renewable energy in Oregon. You talked earlier about the three components. One was renewable energy. Didn't speak much about it as in terms of the car and throttling the car, but we all know that we have a dependence on oil and coal that we need to break. So the question was if you could speak a little bit about how you see that happening in the state. But I also wanted to thank the previous question. Having worked a bit in Salem and in renewable energy, I see that a lot of our politics are in silos, just like you just said. And what we need really is for people to be leaders in this state, to step up, and there's a bunch of you in the room here that need to do that, about a more holistic view. It's not about fixing a specific problem. It's about looking at all of the issues in a holistic manner, whether it's healthcare, education, or power. So I hope that you're going to step up and be that leader. I won't ask that question, but I support your doing that. And the question was really about renewable energy and what your look at the policy would be. Thank you.
I appreciate the question summary at the end there. First of all, I think Governor Kulongoski has done a remarkable job in the last 4 years in repositioning the state around the importance of renewable energy. We've got a long way to go, but I think that was very, very significant. I do think our president is talking about all the right issues in this area, and I actually think that we we are a lot further down the road in moving towards a renewable energy paradigm than we are with healthcare, although the issues and policies are very, very similar. People recognize it. We've actually created a set of economic incentives now where people are making a lot of money in activities that are moving us off of fossil fuel. So the quick answer to your question is I think we need to continue the track that's been established by the current administration. I also think we need to think about how we can further and intentionally engage the economic market, particularly entrepreneurial capitalism, to create enterprises that become ever more profitable by producing services and things that actually move us out of the car, off the road, and towards a much lower carbon economy. Thank you very much.
I can't believe nobody asked him the question. I want to thank you all for coming. Please remember that we're going to have a Friday Forum next week on education here in Oregon. For anybody that's not a member or is considering recruiting, remember we have a new membership table in the back of the room, and I'd like us all to thank our former and perhaps future governor, John Kitzhaber. We're adjourned. Thank you.